is the first of 4 seminars. And as Ray mentioned, we are speaking to Dr. Kar Mei Tang today about careers in economics and economics more generally. And then in the second half, I'll be taking you through some strategies in terms of multiple choice questions. It's likely that in terms of your exams, you'll face multiple choice questions, and in the Olympiad itself, there will be 40 multiple choice. So it's pretty relevant in terms of things as well. So let's start with our interview and our discussion with Kar Mei. Kar Mei, maybe we can start sort of right from the beginning potentially about when did you first get interested in economics?
Thanks, Alex, and pleasure to be here. So I first started getting interested in economics after I had graduated, which is a kind of a funny way to actually progress in economics. I did a Bachelor of Commerce degree at Melbourne University, which is a generalist degree. So it included elements of economics, of accounting, of finance. So I did have the basic background required to practice economics. But it was only when I got into my first role as a graduate in the Securities Commission of Malaysia. So that is a government agency in Malaysia that looks after the regulation of the financial markets there. And I joined the economic analysis team in the office of the chair at that time. And that completely transformed my perception of economics and how to put the theory into practice. A lot of the theory around, the logic of demand and supply, around problem solving, around the toolkits that we were given in university came alive. And it was the ability to combine the quantitative and behavioral science knowledge into applied practical use was where I really found it fulfilling. It was also quite interesting to practice economics at that point in time because I joined the workforce in the mid-1990s. And around that time, there was tremendous upheaval in financial markets all around the world, but particularly in the Asia Pacific. So there was a lot of volatility in financial markets. Part of the main the job that I was doing at that time was to generate economic and market reports for the chair on a daily basis. That quickly became on a half daily basis as markets became more and more volatile. And then that quickly evolved into providing on-the-go policy advice because we were the ones that were actually monitoring the markets full time and able to alert and advise management and the chair as and when significant events were starting to happen or when significant news was coming out from other parts of the world and world markets. So I think for a young economist just starting out in the job at that point in time, it was really exciting and really fulfilling.
That's really interesting. I just to take back to a few points. So in terms of the Securities Commission and Malaysia, is that kind of like the equivalent of ASIC here in Australia?
Yes.
Right. So sort of real oversight over financial markets and the kind of integrity and governance of the financial institutions.
Yeah, exactly right, Alex.
Which is interesting because you wouldn't necessarily think, well, economics would play such a big role in terms of supervising financial markets. But I think that shows us how important economics is overall. And when you're talking about the mid-90s and the changes and things, was this around the time of the Asian financial crisis and kind of currency movements and devaluations and all sorts of stuff in the region?
That's right. And I entered the workforce just before all of that broke loose. So I had the privilege and also the horror of seeing all of that unfold in real time, from the very beginning.
That's really challenging. In terms of what you were saying as well about what attracted you to working in economics, the kind of the ability to combine the theory and the kind of reality and the behavior. Can you talk a little bit more about how some of the economics theory kind of is applied to reality? Because something sometimes teachers hear is that economics is so theory heavy and there's so many graphs and formulas and theories and all that kind of stuff. But you're saying that the links or the application to the real world was very strong.
Yeah, I guess a simple example, and I think that's something that's replicated in markets these days. So it's actually a very topical example is when you see interest rates moving all around the world, and you see a massive rate hike or a rate reduction in the US market, for example. When that's expected, that's not a big deal because markets would have priced that into the pricing of their assets. When they raise it by more than expected, or if they lower it by more than expected, that's where interesting things start to happen. So if you're in the Asia Pacific region, for example, you'll have the privilege of being able to have that news come through either late in the evening the day before or overnight. So you'll be prepared before your markets open. You should have some idea about what the impacts of those interest rate hikes or reductions are on your markets. And if you're in a very volatile market, as it was during that time in the 90s, you might be a little bit more cautious as well, because the heightened sensitivity of the markets means that a couple of things could happen. You could have quite a bit of dysfunction in the markets as investors overreact. And then you could also have the counter effect when regulators overreact to that perceived overreaction. So it's a fine balance where you need to sort of gauge, what is the threshold, the pain threshold you're willing to bear before you start implementing sort of mitigating strategies like circuit breakers in the markets, and other regulatory controls.
I think that's really interesting, and the kind of idea that something that happens in America, then needing to think about how's it going to affect us locally, and maybe how the demand and supply for whatever it might be, funds, all sorts of things, needs to be taken into account. You've obviously had a number of different roles as economists or in economics. Can you tell us? I think that some students may be unaware about what the day-to-day work of an economist is kind of like. You mentioned preparing market reports for the chair and that kind of thing. But if you could take us through, if there is such thing as a typical day as an economist, what it might look like.
Sure, I can do that. I've held a number of different roles as an economist, so I might go through a couple of them just to give you a flavor of what they look like and how different they could possibly be. So one example is the first role that I had after I graduated. I talked about, preparing market reports, policy reports. That then opened up the opportunity to get involved in international affairs and international economics. So that early part of my career opened up the window for me to travel with government delegations and ministerial delegations to various forums like APEC, ASEAN, World Bank annual meetings, and things like that. These delegations tend to be very heavily supported by economists from the various finance ministry agencies and portfolios. The reason that economists are popular on these delegations is because we can provide advice on the go. We can help prepare and advise the minister on meetings and briefings with international investors and government ministers. And we can also help in the preparation of the joint ministerial statements that come out at the end of these forums. So that's one example of day-to-day work, quote unquote, of an economist in one of my early roles. In one of my more recent roles, I was previously the Director of Economic Policy with the New South Wales Department of Premier and Cabinet. And in that role, I had progressed a little bit further in my career by then. So I led a team that provided policy advice to the Premier of New South Wales on policy decisions with economic effects. So this covered a whole range of things like coordinating annual state budget advice to the Premier, advising the Premier on policy proposals coming up from the Treasury portfolio, policy proposals coming out from the Department of Finance Services and Innovation, etc. So a typical day in that kind of a role could look like getting some public transport into the office and checking up on the news overnight just to make sure that you're up to speed on any developments that might impact on state policy. Then once you've arrived at the office, checking on emails to see whether there have been any new decisions or instructions that have come through from your managers or from the Premier's office. And then what I might do is look at the schedule of upcoming cabinet and expenditure review committee meetings. So these are basically committees of ministers that make decisions around expenditure at the state level. And then see what proposals and papers are coming through in the weeks ahead. Then I might have a catch up with my team where we do a whip around. So it's basically going around the team to where everyone speaks for a couple of minutes on the work that they're doing. And then the rest of the team can chip in and provide some feedback and suggestions as well. Then I might probably look into more detail into some of the advice drafted by the team members on a particular policy proposal. So for example, some of the work that I've worked on while I was there was in relation to regulation of short-term holiday letting like Airbnbs.
Right.
Do you let it go full slather or do you put some regulation on it? Other things that we've looked at were, for example, requiring pets to be registered on pet registries. That used to be a pretty fragmented exercise. So you would have different councils running their own pet registries. Some of them might not ever be updated. So you would see, pets on those registers that were 30 years old, which is nice, but kind of improbable.
Not true, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so it's a very, very, very portfolio. It's a great privilege to be able to, have some insights into how some of these machinations work. And then just to round out the day, there might be a briefing to the executive on some of the advice that we've been preparing so that the deputy secretary, for example, can use that information to brief upwards. And then I might have, for example, a task force or a committee meeting with another agency, because in those kinds of roles, we are very often on several committees with other agencies, senior leadership at the same time, where we are working through a particularly complex proposal or regulation that we are trying to develop. So that's what quote unquote, again, typical day would look like.
Given the sort of variety that you experience. I think it's particularly interesting when you're talking there about looking at things like the regulation of Airbnb and pet registration. Can you talk a little bit about how economics comes into play with sort of public policy elements like that, which people might be like, I don't see the link?
Yeah, so Airbnb, and I'm just saying that as a general catch-all for short-term holiday letting, not just the company itself. That is a really interesting one because from an economic perspective, you can see the appeal of it. People have empty accommodation that's not being used and not generating revenue. And there are other people who are looking for accommodation on a short-term basis. So from an purely economic point of view, it makes sense to match these people up so they can meet each other's supply and demand needs. Now, then you have other frictions that come into it. What happens, when the people who are letting these accommodations start to use the amenities of the apartment complex or of the local community to which where that accommodation is located? You might end up with a situation where you have many more people and people who are sort of transient in the community making use of those facilities and perhaps littering, creating additional costs in terms of cleanup, creating additional noise pollution and things like that. So that imposes a cost on the community. And that needs to be taken into account when you're evaluating the costs and benefits of a free-for-all short-term holiday letting regime. So those are some of the things that you need to consider with your sort of economist's hat on when you're thinking about policy and regulation.
I think that's really interesting because something that comes up a lot in senior economics is the idea of externalities and the unintended consequences of production. So someone who is letting out their apartment doesn't set out to increase noise pollution or to make their life more difficult for their neighbours, but these are things to take into consideration when perhaps a pure market might say, just let people rent it so that there's no unused capacity in the holiday market. But what I'm hearing from you is that the idea of unintended consequences of production, which we study at school and university, is then very much applied in the real world as well.
That's right. Very well put.
Thanks. It's very kind of you. I think that something with economics that can come up a lot, particularly when students are thinking about doing the subject or pursuing it, is that it's very maths heavy or that it's very mathsy and highly technical. And no doubt there are elements of economics that applies to it. But is there something that you might say to students or even parents who are concerned about, say, the level of maths and the level of maths ability of the students as well?
Yeah, I think you do need some fundamental baseline level of mathematics proficiency, but you don't need to be, you know, a physicist level mathematician in order to get into economics. I certainly wasn't. And certainly the requirements of the early part of my career did not call for that, you know, really high functioning level of mathematics. What is important is to actually have that toolkit to think logically and in a structured manner. To be able to think critically as well, and dispassionately about a complex problem. So once you can start breaking it down into those components of the problem and then looking at levers and solutions, that's basically the core level skill that you're going to need. So let me try and think of an example. In a previous role I was previously chief circular economist for a government-funded body called New South Wales Circular, where I was working together with government agencies, private companies, and also local councils to look at how we could tackle some really complex solutions around recycling and reduction of waste. So one of the things we were looking at was the creation of food waste. A lot of our waste which goes to landfill is actually food waste. And one of the reasons for that is that there's not enough critical mass in the current mechanisms to gather that food waste and isolate it so that it's clean from plastics. It doesn't have the contamination with other things, you know, which either need to go to landfill or to recycling. And then if you have that clean, critical mass, critical volume of food waste, what you can do with it is you can either send it for composting, where you can then be used by farmers and landscapers, you know, for soil enrichment, or you can send it for energy recovery. So you can send it to an anaerobic digestion facility, which then sort of cooks the food waste, and that creates methane, which then can be piped back into the gas pipeline and be used for cooking and things like that as a form of bioenergy. And then one byproduct of that process is also a form of soil enhancer, which can then again go to the farmers and the landscapers. So that kind of an analysis doesn't require a super high level of maths. You just need to think through the problem. You do need to have, you know, technicians there who actually are skilled in chemistry, which is an interesting pivot. So what I'm trying to say here is that there are a lot of other complementary disciplines to the economics discipline. Maths is just one of them, but, you know, you have economists who are also really good engineers. You have economists who are really good scientists. You have economists who are really good doctors in the medical field, or even artists, etc. And all of that can be beneficial depending on the area that you're looking at.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And that this idea also that as an economist, you're sort of rarely working just by yourself, that you're working with others and consulting other experts. And so if you have that toolkit, as you were talking about, thinking critically, asking those great questions, thinking about the kind of overall impacts of something and how things are interrelated, then that can be where your skill is. And that as long as you have those kind of fundamental maths ability or can develop them along the way, that's not an obstacle to progressing in the profession.
Absolutely right, yes.
I think that's really interesting. You've mentioned a number of super interesting projects: holiday rentals, pets, food waste. Are there any sort of other really interesting projects that jump to mind that you've worked on as an economist?
I can think of a few. One of them would probably be the development of the 20-year waste strategy and plastics plan for the New South Wales government. So I was involved in the early stages of development of those plans. These are massive strategies because they are quite complex. They need to touch on all aspects of waste management within the state. So from an economist point of view, it's actually really, really interesting because you're looking at how some of these markets operate. When you're looking at the circular economy, for example, most people kind of think of things like recycling or reusing. And one critical part of the economics puzzle is what happens to the stuff after you've recycled it? Like, Who's buying it? How much does it cost? What's the price difference relative to something, that's made up of a non-recycled product? That's actually quite a wicked problem because recycled content competes on a price basis with non-recycled content. And very often the non-recycled content is cheaper and easier to procure and manufacture. So you need to put your economist hat on and think about how you can change the trajectory of that picture. And it might involve things like government subsidies or some policy levers to help with the transition of the recycled market to be on a cost competitive basis with non-recycled, or even better still, looking at the design of products and services where you actually design out waste altogether so you don't have to deal with the issue of having to recycle waste.
I think that's really interesting and ties in economics with environmental sustainability and, sort of all sorts of other concepts that might go beyond traditional macro and micro views of things as well. Something that I wanted to ask you about in terms of your role and your work is in terms of your work in the Women in Economics network that a number of people, including the Reserve Bank, have sort of looked at the numbers of people going into economics, and also that it's kind of that the number of girls choosing to study economics and go through has been on the decline, and that there's really important place for diversity and having diverse views and people in a profession like economics. Maybe if you can talk a little bit about your role at the Women in Economics Network and the goals and the kind of sort of activities you're taking part in as well.
Sure. So I've only recently stepped down as the chair of Women in Economics New South Wales, and I've taken up a new role as the deputy chair of the National Committee for Women in Economics. My role in the National Committee is as the sort of deputy chair looking after the industry and policy part of the profession. There is another deputy chair who looks after the academic part of the profession. So that gives you a little bit of a nutshell in terms of, the broad areas of career progression that economists tend to go into. Yes, that point that you noted around, the role of women in economics and also the lack of inclination of many students, particularly girls, to enter into economics. It's always been a bit of a concern, and that's one of the reasons why the whole Women in Economics network was conceived, to actually provide a forum for girls and women interested in economics to speak to their peers and to speak to maybe people who are further up along their career paths, to understand what the opportunities and pitfalls and challenges and learnings are, and to actually benefit from those learnings. And we also want to give back as well. I think personally, I've received a lot from the profession and from my peers. And I'd really love to see more girls taking it up, because I think it's such an enriching profession. There are so many opportunities that perhaps, and I certainly was not aware of it when I graduated from high school. I was only maybe 10% aware of it when I graduated from university. I think coming out into the working place, it's just really opened my mind and broadened my horizons in terms of the broad range of sectors and areas that you could look at as an economist. So yeah, I think we really want to have that role modeling and those conversations happening, better understand, what are some of the drawbacks or barriers, or maybe lack of knowledge about what the opportunities are, and see whether we can help bridge those gaps.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredibly important work, and that there's such a number of chief economists these days who are women. There's so many economists that are leading the conversation, and it's kind of trying to filter that down and give more girls and women the confidence to pursue things and to come up as well, which is really important. So I think it'd be useful to continue those conversations with us as well, to talk about any ideas you have about encouraging that interest among students as well.
Love to.
Yeah, one question also that we were thinking about was that in order for yourself into sort of looking at what to study at university, you sort of must have had a number of degrees that you were thinking of or had the option of, and then a number of careers that you would sort of potentially go on and through. What do you think about this career choice in terms of going between like commerce and business versus economics? Obviously there are lots of different opportunities, investment banking, regulation, all sorts of stuff. But if students are sort of thinking about that pathway of like, I'm really interested in commerce and business, I'm not sure whether I might want to pursue economics.
Yeah, look, there is overlap between the disciplines, so no doubt about it. Someone like myself who, had an initial degree in commerce and then ended up pursuing a career in economics is a classic case in point. So my first actual real degree in economics was my PhD, which came, further down the track. But I think whether you are studying it or practicing it, I think there is a lot of really interesting work. Now, going back to your original question about, should I be studying commerce and business or looking at economics, I would really encourage you to look deeper into the subject and find out what piques your interest and your attention. And also, have a look at the people who are actually practicing in the fields of business and commerce and economics and see whether there is something that you might be interested in exploring a little bit further, because there is no doubt about it. If you do an economics degree from the outset, that does put you, on, it gives you more understanding and knowledge before going out to practice as an economist. So there is a slight advantage there. But like I said, life is a process, it's a long process. And nowadays, many of us sort of pivot around our careers as we sort of understand ourselves better and what we want to do and what we're passionate about. So I think at some point or other, economics can and should play a role, whether you're practicing in it or not. But I have personally found it to be really fulfilling, both learning and practicing it. So I'm hoping that, most of the people online will find that to be the case too.
I think that's a really good lesson to take from it as well. I've got a few more things I'd love to ask, but I want to open it up to the group for questions as well. If you would like to either put your hand up to ask a question or to put it in the chat, if you're there in the audience and would like to ask something, then please do. I'll ask another question. We'll give some people some time to think about it. Something that we sort of ask many professionals in the industry is that this advice for anyone that is interested in pursuing a career in economics. And there's kind of sort of things about, read widely or listen to podcasts or kind of follow up current developments. In terms of if someone came to you and said, look, I'm kind of interested in it, what would be some things to think about? What kind of ideas might you have for people?
Oh, that is a really good question. I really want to repeat what you've just said in terms of what other people have answered. But let me try and think of something a little bit more original.
It's okay.
I think one of the things which is really important is to continually have a curious mind. Because you're going to come across a lot of really interesting things, sometimes really weird things coming up in the field of economics. Sometimes, the data might throw up a curveball and you'll be thinking, that's interesting. I didn't expect that to happen. And that's kind of the classic hallmark of an economist, because they want to actually understand it a little bit better and, understand the way that the world works, understand the way that the data is telling you and what it's trying to say to you. So I think that sense of curiosity and maintaining that sense of curiosity is really important. And again, I think keeping track of current affairs and also political developments is really both interesting and very helpful, because those invariably come into play in most fields of economics. So it's really important to have that sort of latent knowledge in the background, because very often they're quite important levers of economic work.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful in terms of how to pursue that interest in economics. Something that I would often tell students in terms of their essays when they're looking to differentiate themselves is to talk about where the reality diverges from the theory as well. It's sort of really interesting that we develop these models and these ways of working, and then to go into the real world and look at, wait a sec, why is it going this way? and sort of what does that tell us about things more broadly. I think that that's a really interesting way as well, that being curious, why is this happening the way it is? And kind of what does the theory tell us the way this should work?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And there's such an important question to keep asking yourself, because very often we fall into the trap, and professional economists do that all the time as well. We look at, what conventional wisdom tells us and what orthodox thinking tells us, and we say, if X happens, we need to do Y in order to fix X. But to your point, you could, keep doing Y for a long period of time, and then you look back and think, gee, that hasn't affected X at all. So you got to go back to the drawing board and think about why that's the case.
Yeah, I think that's really good to think about. We have a question from the group, which I think is really good, particularly for you, because you have such a varied career in the private and public sector. And so the question here is asking about, is there much of a difference in career paths or employability for those that would love to go into the private versus the public sector?
Yes and no. You do get some degree of hopping in between the public and private sectors. So it's not uncommon to find people with experience in both. In terms of career paths, I think that you will get good opportunities either way, because economists are fairly well entrenched in both the public and the private sectors. In the public sector, for example, you have entire agencies like treasuries, full of economists, but they're also present in other agencies, like in health, for example, you've got health economists. In environment, you have environmental economists and things like that. So there are also niches and areas for you to specialize in particular areas of economics if you're interested in that, and that can absolutely happen. And similarly in the private sector as well, there are sector specializations. You could become a specialist in competition economics, and your career would be providing consulting services to companies that are perhaps interested in merging, and then you could be an expert witnesses in court cases and trials in competition issues, or you could work for the ACCC and analyze takeover and merger bids and strategies to see whether there are any anti-competitive elements of that or not. So those are some of the examples. And then you also have some of the more classic examples, like going into consulting for economics, where you would probably get into, quite a wide range of different projects, which is, again, really interesting, and then proceed up the consulting ladder to perhaps become a partner or a principal. Or you could work for a bank and then go on to become chief economist of a bank, focusing on, macroeconomics and public policy analysis and things like that.
So lots of opportunities either way,
Absolutely,
you would say.
yeah.